Okay, my name is Jen Weber, and I'm here with Braden Lawrence to see if we can get some of the guides ready for Ember 3.5. During this event, we're going to not only go over what I do as a maintainer of the guides, but also what makes a good pull request and how to evaluate your own work if you are about to get started with something like Hacktoberfest.
And I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat for your questions to ask Jen and be asking a few of my own.
All right, so I'm going to start the screen share here. And can you go check to make sure that this is actually going? Thank you. All right, so first things first, a lot of these pull requests are coming in pretty fast thanks to Hacktoberfest, which is an event that happens every year on around October, where you can submit 5 pull requests to an open source library and get some swag like a t-shirt or stickers and things like that. So is that working? Great. Okay.
Sure is.
So I recommend that you check it out if you haven't already. It's really fun to meet other people out and about who are wearing this t-shirt and find out what kinds of things they're working on. So let's start with talking about what makes a good pull request and what I look at when I'm actually evaluating one of them. So this is a pull request that Chris opened about 4 days ago or so to really improve the intro section on the Ember guides. So let's take a look at exactly what was there before compared to what his work has introduced. So let's go to guides. So this is what is present today. So it starts right off the bat. The first section someone would read in Ember, if they're just getting started, is, you'll notice that normal JavaScript patterns aren't widely used in Ember. So that's not a statement. This is a statement that's easy to misunderstand. It's something that leads new people astray a lot, because in reality, a lot of working in Ember is working with regular JavaScript conventions. And as time goes on, we're just getting closer and closer to those patterns, not away from them. So as part of an issue that was opened up for Hacktoberfest, we wanted to write a friendlier introduction to this objects guide. So Chris here picked up this pull request, did a little bit of iteration, and I'm going to show you what I'm looking for when trying to decide if this is ready to merge or not. So the first thing I always check is to see whether or not the tests have passed. So every pull request to guide source and a lot of the other things in the Ember ecosystem all run through a test environment called Travis. And with Travis, I can see in sort of like a clean environment, like a clean install, a clean test, what happens when these tests are run. So if Chris's work resulted in a failing test, I'd actually be able to just look in this interface here and know what that failing test was without having to run it locally. And I would get some details that would maybe help me suggest the next thing that a contributor could do to address that request.
And how would Chris know that it's passing all the tests before he submits the PR?
That's something where you can just run npm install or yarn install to make sure you have the right version of the dependencies, and then run Ember test if it's an Ember app. If it's not an Ember app, we have a few things that are not Ember apps. npm test would do something similar. So let's take a look here. So I'm going to make sure that I have the latest master for guide source. The guide source is the repository that has a lot of the educational content that's found here on the Ember site. So it's not the app itself that determines what the layout is, but there's a whole bunch of markdown files where people can do some writing. So one of the things that I do when I'm going to be reviewing a pull request is I click here to see the command line instructions. And I do these first 2 lines. So since I've already reviewed this pull request once, I already have the branch locally, so I'm going to do git checkout. That. Oh, maybe I don't. Maybe I was working on a different computer. So I'm going to grab this here. And then I'm going to take this next line. And
what did that just do?
So I'm grabbing the work that is on Chris's fork, and I'm pulling it down onto my local machine so that I can look it over and see if it's ready to merge.
Gotcha. So all the work Chris was doing on his branch, you now have like as it is on his computer.
Yep. And if we do like git log, for example, actually, I make this a little bit bigger. If we do git log, we can see that, here was one of his commits. So now I already know that the test passed based on this Travis check here, but our apps, like the guides, they have good test coverage, but it's not 100%. So what I want to do here is actually look myself just to confirm that everything renders as expected within the guides when I'm running it locally, as well as I want to check this most recent commit to update one of the links and just make sure that link actually works within the app. So in order to do that, I'm going to grab we're going to look at the guides app, which is the app that builds and renders all of these markdown files. I'm going to make sure I have the latest. And you'll see that I'm doing this git pull upstream master. The way that I arrange my work is, actually, let me just clear this out for a second. I have some uncommitted work. So the way that I manage my own Git workflow as a maintainer is that I add different remotes. So Origin is my own fork of the guides app, which I do most of my work on the fork unless I know that another one of the maintainers might want to just put commits directly on it. For the most part, I do my work on a fork. So Origin, this is my fork. And then upstream is whatever the base project itself is. So you can add more, I would say remotes or maybe forks. I'm not exactly sure of the terminology. You can do git add remote, and we could call it something like, another fork, and then some URL, git at GitHub, whatever, that goes to that fork.
So and you don't have to call them Origin or upstream. Those are just names that you can't give them.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So I just choose to call them upstream because that's what makes sense to me.
Right.
I don't know. I feel like I probably saw it on like a maintainer's guide or something. Another thing that I do is I always make sure that for my own fork, I let master alone. I don't make any commits to master on my fork because that way I can always do git pull upstream master and it's not going to conflict with what's on my own machine.
So when you do get updates to your master, what happens to your branches that you're working on?
The branches stay.
They get those updates along with the master?
No, the branches don't update automatically.
Gotcha.
You have to do that via Git directly. But the branches themselves aren't hurt by having those different remotes around.
Gotcha.
Oh no, I have npm installed during a live stream. Should have done that before. This probably won't take too long. Famous last words.
Right.
So while that's going, we can go over a couple other things that I'm looking for before I merge something. So most pull requests for the Ember Learning team require a reviewer. So in this case, I've done the review. And what you can do with a review is basically choose any line, of code or something that's been done. And instead of just adding a comment, you can actually add a review. That's nice because it takes all of your comments and then only pings the contributor once. Whereas if I did add a single comment, depending on their notification settings, it might ping them over and over. They might get a whole flurry of emails, and that's just kind of distracting. Whereas the review, I would click Start Review, and when I'm done, it'll ask me to complete the review. That'll, help reduce some of that alert fatigue. So I've already reviewed this once in the past. I requested some changes, which you can actually look over the things that were changed at each step. And then assuming that all of this works fine, I'll click Approve Changes, and then this should be able to be merged. Okay, so one of the tricky things about working with the guides is that the guides app by default tries to get a deployed version of the guides source. So that's all those markdown files that people have been working on. Whereas I want to see what it looks like when I have Chris's changes here. So the way to do that is with a feature of NPM as well as Yarn. It's called NPM Link. So what NPM Link is doing here is it's going to run an install of all the dependencies, and then it creates sort of like a reference to this, creates a reference to my local copy of the guides. And then in guides app, I'm going to take the name of the package for the guide source, which was at emberlearn/guide source. And I'm going to say npm link at emberlearn/guide source. It's almost sort of like, npm installing something locally.
So how does Link actually do that? Does it kind of like include the files as like a public directory for the other app?
No, it actually references wherever they were on the hard drive. So if I go in and make changes to the guide source code, that'll automatically show up over here on the app side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Can actually show what that looks like.
Gotcha. So
in a moment.
This isn't a normal setup that most apps have, is it?
You mean like Ember apps in general?
You're right.
No, this isn't normal in the sense that Ember apps come in all different shapes and sizes. But it is normal in the sense that Ember works really well for creating static as well as dynamic content. And one of the other members of the Ember Learning core team, Chris Manson, kind of pioneered this way for us to have static sites that run quickly, that have pre-built content. And those apps are sort of in two different pieces. So on one piece, one half of it is the Ember app, the other half of it is the markdown files themselves. And that gives us a couple advantages. One thing is that the app that is responsible for building up all of those files and kind of creating something that people can use, that app is very stable and doesn't require changes very often. Whereas guide source is sort of constantly moving, but it's moving in terms of markdown content. not
see.
like things that are making or breaking how an app works. And having that separation of concerns is really like, it's really nice and clean. And it's a pattern that is present in the Ember guides. It's present in the deprecation app, the Ember CLI guides project that I'm working on, some stuff that Chris has been doing for like a blog that he's been working on. And so it's becoming more and more common, I'd say.
Gotcha. So it lets you sort of, there's no reason why you couldn't have all those markdown files in with the rest of the app that generates, that shows it. It just makes it easier to like separate out
so I would say
engine from the content.
It is that, but it also, there are strong reasons to not put them together in the same app.
Mm-hmm.
If you put them together in the same app, the problem that you have is that then your app bundle is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here, you know, sort of what we're doing is this is being transformed into JSON that can be fetched, and like there's this is like a very nice lightweight approach to the guides that you wouldn't get if you were just throwing markdown files in public. I mean, we have, gosh, I don't know, thousands of files that are what make up the guides, because for every topic here, there's a bunch of subtopics. And then for every version, minor version of Ember going back to 110, we have this same tree over and over again. So
all of these subtopics are multiplied by the number of versions.
Wow. So a lot of thought has been put into how to make that fast and lightweight, but also make it an Ember app, which is something that I think it was released. It used to not be an Ember app, and it got turned into an Ember app like March of last year. Anyway, so let's take a look. We're running this locally here, and we're going to take a peek at what this pull request looks like. So now we have this much friendlier sentence written by Chris, different Chris than the Chris who made the static site stuff, which instead of it saying, you know, hey, everything in Ember might look different to you. Instead, it's going to say one of the first things you'll notice when you generate JavaScript files in Ember is that most of the code you'll write goes inside of an object. While an Ember object might look a lot like an ES 2015 class, it has some special properties. So now it's sort of spun around that it's like classes and then some. And so if you already know how to work with classes and objects, you're off for a good foundation.
But a much friendlier introduction overall.
Yeah, way better. So we're going to just see the latest thing that Chris updated was in his original pull request. When I first reviewed it, this computed properties link here was a direct link. So it said, you know, www.emberjs.com/guide/objects/computed properties, whatever. Whereas what we really want is for this to be a relative link so that no matter what version of the guides you're on, you will stay on that version when you navigate to other parts of that guide. So we're just going to check to make sure that that works. It does work. That's awesome. And everything else has already been reviewed in the past. The tests are passing. And so I'm going to approve the changes that have been made. And then down here, there's a couple options available to me about how I actually get this into the rest of the code base. So a merge commit, what a merge commit will do is it'll keep all of the commit history as it is. And so if I did a merge commit, there would be these 6 commit messages included in the overall commit history of the project. Whereas what I like to do is squash and merge, which takes all those commits, lets you turn them into one descriptive thing, and then it's a whole lot easier if someone wants to look and see what changes were made recently to this app. They can read this one sentence description instead of each of the little tiny tweaks.
So
along
when
the
you
way.
do squash and merge, though, do you still have access to all the other comments they wrote in the other commits?
Yeah,
Is that right?
that's true.
Okay.
Let's see. Fixes number 155. All right, so I'm going to do squash and merge. I'm going to change fixes to closes. So one of the cool things about GitHub's automation is if you say closes and then some issue number, it'll actually close that issue for you automatically. So we're going to say our more readable title will say update intro to objects to be beginner friendly. Let's see if it yells at me about the length. Nope, we're good. All right, and then I'm gonna do squash and merge. Now, theoretically, if we open up issue 155, you can see here that it is already closed. I like to comment closed by merging number 186, just because I think, especially for new contributors, it can look a little confusing when it just says, they just get an email that says the issue was closed. So I like to follow it up by saying, that it was closed because the thing was merged, not because, that isn't going to be worked on. So I'm going to comment that.
Now, will the author automatically get a notification of your comment? I know
depending on what their settings are. So
Gotcha.
you can configure your email alerts and things however you want to, but I try to imagine that someone gets alerted by everything that I do and choose kind of a light touch when I can.
Gotcha. What kind of settings do you use?
Oh, mine are like pretty intense. So for things like guide source, I get emails every time an issue or pull request is open because it's something that I watch very closely. Whereas other projects like, I don't know, Super Rentals, for example, I have that set to just email me if I'm mentioned. Because other people more actively maintain that resource.
And that's more the kind of notification settings that you'd have for most projects.
Yep. All right, so we still have a little bit of time, so I'm going to go ahead and do another pull request here. So autocomplete component, correct contraction grammar. So let's have a look here. They changed. We only use the key event to let our code know that it's time to make a search. Okay, so this is a good pull request. So you know that you want to use it apostrophe s because it apostrophe s is short for it is. So to let our code know that it is time to make a search. So this is a good correction. You'll notice that this contributor made the changes to only version 3.4.0. As I mentioned, we have files going all the way back to 110, but we really only make an effort to maintain the most recent release.
Would their change be accepted if they did, say, take the time to go back and correct it all the way back through time?
It depends on what the change is. If the change is a broken link, I accept it. If the change is something that is really seriously, blatantly wrong, like actively misinformation that's going to hurt some poor person whose code is stuck back on the earlier version, you might take it. But for other things, we really strongly recommend just doing the latest release version. Because it's less overhead for the maintainers. I want to be spending my time kind of moving the guides forward and not QCing small tweaks to, 30 files, if that makes any sense.
So in this case, even though it is a small typo, that is probably there in previous versions. You
Yep.
probably, like, just as a courtesy to the maintainers, you don't want to be
care.
like making them go all the way through.
Don't care. Everyone from 3.4 onwards is going to get this corrected grammar. Everybody before is going to have to live with it. And it's just because you have to pick and choose your battles. So I can tell just by looking at this that this is fine. The tests pass. So, you know, I know that there's no like funky, like weird white space or, you know, this isn't broken in any way. Like I can trust the tests and I can trust just looking at it myself to know that this is a good pull request. And this isn't going to break anything. So I feel pretty good about just go ahead and merge this. But before I can do that, I have to add a review. I'm going to say thanks a bunch for catching this. I've also been saying there's one more thing. Since it's Hacktoberfest, we're going to see if this person has already made some pull requests or not. I'm going to sort by recently updated. Okay, so they have done 3 pull requests to this repository, so this person is well on their way to Hacktoberfest, and I'm pretty sure that I commented before saying that they might want to do Hacktoberfest. I hope I did that. 1, 2, 3. Let's look in this one. Yeah, I already told them that they could have a Hacktoberfest just because, like, might as well get a t-shirt.
Yeah, they're well on their way to getting some swag.
All right, so prove, submit review. Now, if we go back here, we can see everything is green. There's only one commit here, and that's a really good commit message, so I'm gonna just leave it. So I'm gonna do merge, commit, merge pull request, confirm, and this one's done.
Great.
Removes extra info for Ember run wrapping. All right, we're gonna look at this one. I am sighing because I don't actually know very much about Ember Run, and so kind of what I'm expecting is that I'm actually not a good person to review this pull request, and I might ask for somebody else to take a look. Oh boy. Let's see. Really presenting with this. All right, so we're cutting out some of those things. Okay, so you'll see here this person actually went ahead and did the PR for the 3.0 onward. Again, I don't know a ton about the run loop, but I do know that Ember development used to rely on it, but more and more and more people who are writing Ember 3 code really shouldn't be messing with the run loop much. And so this is maybe a good example of something where, like, okay, maybe it does make sense to put this a little bit further backwards. But I would say for anyone who's working on a pull request, you know, when in doubt, just make the pull request for the latest version. And if we think that it should go a little further back, we might ask you to help out with that as well.
Now, you said that you aren't super informed about like what this section is. How would you go about finding someone that did know about this section and whether or not that should be removed?
Good question. I would, well, there's a couple of people I know off the top of my head who might have an idea. So Siva, who's on the Ember Learning core team, has been doing Ember for quite some time, and like Siva has really good explanations, not just for like how things are today, but why they're that way, and then some of the deeper internals. And so Siva is someone who I go to pretty quickly if I'm really out of my depth with something like this. But if you don't know, don't all go to Siva. If you don't know exactly what you're dealing with, the Ember Learning channel on the Ember Community Discord, there's people who check that pretty much all times a day, and you can really just ask there, like, hey, can anyone tell me more about X or Y? It's not expected that when someone starts an issue that they know everything about that issue.
Yeah, that's good to know, because a lot of times when I'm looking at the issue queue, like I will go through it and I'll have no idea what any of them are talking about. So it's good to know that you aren't expected to be an expert on them before you start.
Right. Campus PR, and let me know your thoughts. All right, so I'm just leaving a little note here for Siva, because Siva knows a lot more about the run loop than I do. We're going to go back to the PR queue and see if there's something else that is reviewable and maybe mergeable. Ooh. Oh, I like this pull request. Okay, so we don't really have a good description of how to do relative links in the guides, and so it's not uncommon for someone to add a relative link and then push their pull request and see the test fail, and like that's confusing. So there's an issue open here asking for somebody to try and describe how to actually do the relative links. And looks like this contributor's picked it up. So since this is just changing contributing markdown, which is, let me pull up what that actually looks like here. So currently it's this guide here that describes how someone can make their first pull request and some notes about like, please open pull requests for just the latest version in most cases. We've got a style guide, all sorts of stuff. So this means that no matter what is in this PR, it's not actually part of the code base, it's not part of our website, it's part of the documentation to help other contributors when they're looking at this repository in GitHub. So that means there's nothing to run locally. We just want to make sure that when we look at the markdown itself, that it is kind of like a consistent formatting. So this is writing prose and code samples. When linking to topics from guide MD files, use relative links when referencing a topic. Incorrect. Correct. Reference a topic when you're in index MD. Example.
So
reference.
What we see here, this isn't how it will look when it's in the final page. This is just an example of like the markdown formatting.
That's right, I think, if I understand your question correctly. So these links, when someone's actually making these links within the guide's content, they're going to show up like normal links. But
Gotcha.
This is instructing, if someone's looking at the raw markdown as they're writing some new content, this will give them some clues about how to handle those links.
Sure.
So when I look at this, there's a couple things that come to mind. Is like, okay, this whole section is a little hard to read because here's our heading, style guide. And then there's all of these subtopics that aren't really formatted like subtopics. So that by the time we get down here, this is sort of a heading, but then the actual content takes up almost the entire page view. And so on one hand, I'm thinking like, oh, I would really like this to be a proper markdown heading. But that's sort of outside of the scope of this pull request, because if we make this a markdown heading, then a whole bunch of other things have to become markdown headings. And so fixing it is actually beyond just what this contributor has accomplished. And so one of the challenges as a maintainer is trying to decide, like, okay, to what extent do you ask for someone to make an update when you realize, like, oh, actually this thing could be structured even better, versus recognizing when that change is out of scope and should just be part of another pull request. Ultimately, small pull requests are much, much easier to manage. And so although I'm kind of tempted to ask them to reformat this, I'm not going to, because I'd rather have somebody go in and make all of it consistent and easier to read.
Is it pretty subjective, like what is in scope versus out of scope, or do you have like any guidelines?
No, it's pretty subjective. But a lot of organizations have more rigid procedures around, what is allowed to go in a pull request. So, for example, some companies that use continuous integration, continuous deployment, aka CI/CD, where every merge to master gets automatically released to production or somewhere, maybe staging. That kind of environment, there are rules about what kinds of pull requests. Well, what a good pull request is going to be really different.
Yeah, you have to be.
Yeah. So for me, I just sort of, lean towards smaller pull requests is better. And I'm not really going to ask for somebody to do a whole lot more work if what they have already submitted is something that's for sure going to help other people. And when I look this over, I see, for sure going to help. So, and just looking over this content, this is what I expect to see. I've done a lot of these links myself. I'm pretty sure it's correct. If it's not correct, I think hopefully someone will speak up. But in my experience, this is how it works. So I'm going to go back to the pull request. And I'm going to review, approve, thanks. A bunch. This will be helpful. 2.2 during your reviews.
Can anyone that's a maintainer to this project write reviews for it?
Not just maintainers. Other people can write reviews as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So let's see. For example, I am not a maintainer of the core framework library. And if we wanted to, let's see, who could I pick on? I guess just in case I mess this up, I'll pick on this person who I know. So I'm not a maintainer. I can't merge pull requests here, but I actually can go ahead and make a review if I wanted to. I could say, hey, I think this thing ought to be some other way. And that is super handy because, as you can see, it's been about an hour and we've made it through 3 pull requests and there's 10 more in here. So whenever community members are able to jump in and lend their expertise or their suggestions, that helps out a ton. If it was always up to only the project maintainers, For one thing, that's a lot of work, but more importantly, especially with this content where it's like about learning, having more perspectives on how something could be worded clearly or like a way that something could be explained is very, very valuable because we all read things and understand things a little bit differently. So anyway, anyone could add a review there. So I'm going to, let's see, there's only one commit and add linking reference to contributing MD. Perfect. So that's a good descriptive commit message. All the tests are passing. So I'm going to go ahead and merge this. Cool. That one's done. Explain how to transition between routes. Okay, let's see. I need to tamper with existing section orders. Okay. So this is a really helpful note that this person lets me know how they made those decisions. Oh wait, I forgot one thing. We need to make sure we got to go close that other pull request. Or the issue rather. So we're going to do this. Merged. Okay, close. So since we didn't put closes, number 193 in the commit message, it didn't close automatically. So I had to make sure to go back, close this. That way nobody else picks it up and does duplicate work, because that's like when I feel the saddest, usually as a maintainer, is if somebody's done a lot of work and somebody else did a lot of the same work, and then they both have pull requests, and that makes me, I feel bad that, you know, the time was sort of doubly spent.
That must be really hard to choose.
So sometimes they're compatible and sometimes not. Generally speaking, if we have to choose, we choose whichever pull request is open first.
It's like the only fair way you could do it.
Yeah, in some cases, if the things aligned very well, I'll merge them both. If it's someone who like it's their first contribution, because that's pretty sad as well. It's like, oh, you finally get up the courage to do your first contribution, and then somebody's like, oops, somebody else already did this. And you're like, no, I did it wrong. I'll never do it again. And so a couple of times I have merged them both, or like did a little bit of work to reconcile them. So at least something from what the other person did makes it into the guides. Because I mean, I want to encourage people to jump in, and if that means I have to do a little bit of extra work, that's just what I do. Okay, explain how to transition between routes. So another thing I look for in a pull request is what was explained in the issue, and then did that person accomplish the things that were requested there? Is there anything missing? Whatever. So we're going to take a look and see what we've got here. So I like to read this sort of thing as markdown as well. So we're looking for the transitioning between routes header. Another thing that I look for as well is whether the hierarchy of headings has been followed. So we're also going to look not just at it as markdown, but I'm going to look at the raw. So we can see here that within this topic, we're using 2 hashtags as the heading level. So it's like an H2. And I'm just going to make sure that that is what's being followed, and it is. Brayden, why is your phone making so much noise? Shh. All right. It's interrupting the live stream. How will we learn? Right. So I was looking at this, how to transition between routes. So we're going to look for transitioning between routes. Once routes are defined, how we go about transitioning between them within our application on depends on where the transition needs to take place. From a template, use link to, as mentioned above. From a route, use transition to method. From a controller, use transition to route method. For anywhere else in your application, such as a component, inject the router service, use the transition to method. Cool. So, a couple things that I notice here is that it doesn't exactly flow straight from this content here, but you can already see that there's a little bit of a trend where like these are kind of subtopics. It's like, oh, you want to do this thing? You can do that. You want to do route handle, dealing with route handlers? Here's some links. So we already have an established pattern where, we've gone over the most basic features of routes, and these are more like kind of like, hey, did you know you can do this stuff? Oh, are you looking for this information? It's almost like an appendix. And so I think that this is in keeping with the overall flow of the rest of this topic. So that's really nice. And this is a good clue for people who are just learning Ember. This is obvious to me, but they don't know this stuff. So I'm going to check these links. Links to the API docs typically point towards release, just because, actually I'm going to look at these one at a time. It's a bit difficult for us to update them all the time for every release. So link to, we're going to check to make sure that we go to the link to helper. Here we are. That's great. The transition to method. Super. Transition to route. Very nice. And lastly, the router service. Awesome. Yep, and that's the right link format. And this guy. Great. Okay, so all the links are good. I also just sometimes read the content aloud if it's brand new content, just to make sure that it sounds natural. This is important because a huge percentage of the people who use the Ember guides, they're all over the world. And so if we use tricksy, weird wording in English, that's going to make it that much harder for them to learn. And it's going to make it that much harder for all of the, other English speakers to learn as well. Like how using simpler explanations, shorter sentences, etc., it benefits everybody. So I'm just going to read this aloud. So once the routes are defined, how do we go about transitioning between them within our application? It depends on where the transition needs to take place. Transitioning between them. So, So one thing that we could say to simplify this is instead of transitioning between them, we could say, how can we? Actually, this is probably the simplest explanation. Because I'm sort of thinking like transitioning between them. Transitioning between them isn't really like I don't think of that as like plain old JavaScript-y. But I might say navigate between routes. But honestly, transition is the word that is used here in all of these other API things. We've got good links for people to follow. And so, we haven't defined, we defined what a transition is. If you want to transition to a route, transition to a wildcard route. I'm thinking by the time someone's made it to this point in the page, they have an idea of what routes are based on all of these other examples. So I think this is probably fine.
Now, when you are reviewing the language in these PRs,
Mm-hmm.
how much do you pay attention to like making sure they all have the same voice or sound like it's all written by the same person?
So some, I guess, and by that I mean, I guess it's less about the same voice and more about trying to make sure that we're writing for the same audience.
Gotcha.
So, like the way that individual people structure sentences, the way they, refer to certain subtopics, that does have some variation from one person to the next. But ultimately, I want to make sure that we are writing content that is accessible to people who are just learning Ember. And a lot of times that level of simplification is kind of like a voice in a sense.
So just as an example for this case, how would you define the audience for this article?
Oh, the audience for all of the guides is people just learning Ember.
Gotcha.
And so this is the case here. And so one thing that I could think about, like maybe want to do here, transitioning between rounds, like we don't really say what a transition is. You could say like a transition is when a user is able to navigate from one route to another within the app. But again, coming back into what's in scope, what's out of scope, by the time they've gotten to this part of the page, they ought to know what a transition is. And if they don't know what a transition is, that's maybe a separate issue that should be tackled somewhere else.
Makes sense.
So, all right. So I'm going to merge this. Let me just say from a template, use link to. From a route, use transition to method. From a controller, use transition to route method. For anywhere else in your application, so there's a component, inject the router service and use the transition to method. Another thing here that this contributor is doing well, you'll notice that they put parentheses after the method, and if you read the Ember style guide, that is what you're supposed to do. So everything here checks out very nicely. So let's see, there's one commit. Explain how to transition between routes. That's nice and semantic, and there's only one. So I'm going to add my review. Submit review. I'll check that test. Everything is green. Confirm the merge. Lovely. And then we're going to say for this issue, hi. Thanks for this PR. I think I agree. That's the best spot for the content.
Now, after you've merged this, what if another reviewer comes in and disagrees with it?
If I've already reviewed it, but it hasn't been merged yet, then they can, we can discuss it. If they disagree with that decision and it's already been merged, for the most part, for this project, we would do another pull request.
Gotcha.
From that person to correct whatever a problem was or something like that.
Would you open up a new issue for that to log it?
Yeah.
Sure.
It's helpful. In cases where there's major breaking changes, we would, we have ways to roll back. So this app isn't continuous deployment, but some other things are, like the website, for example, the homepage and all that. If someone, maybe there's some like breaking change to the CSS or whatever, we could actually roll that back in the, via our hosting providers or through GitHub means, or like we have a whole bunch of tools at our disposal. Pretty frequently what you'll see in the guide source is it's pretty unusual for someone to say after the fact that something is incorrect. What's a lot more common is someone comments to ask for an iteration or says like, oh, I'm not really sure about that. And then other people can jump in and comment. And ideally, we get those perspectives, we get that iteration from the group. I can actually show you an example of what that looks like in 1 minute. So are we on the issue? Yes. Closed with merging. Number 157. Oops. That was weird. Oh, here we go.
It just changed it to 196.
Yeah. So we're on issue 157. 196 is the pull request number. Sure. I got it backwards. So I'm going to close that. Super. Next. Oh, wow. Someone made more issues. This is great. I was excited. I'm going to mark, where did I see? Run loop documentation needs to be updated. I'm going to label this as, oops. Oh man, what is it doing? Wait. What happened? Oh, it unchecked itself. That's not awesome. So I'm going to remove, I know there's a pull request open for this run loop stuff. And I don't really want another pull request until we figure out what's going on with that. So I'm going to needs contributor response. Actually, that's not really accurate. I want has PR. And I want to remove. Oh, I don't know why it's being annoying. Where's the run loop? I'm gonna remove needs contributor response because really it needs a pull request review. Okay. That's all fine. Requests. Wow, this is great. Okay, so I want to come back to this one.
Why does that one stand out?
Well, that's the one we looked at earlier where I was like, I don't know what's going on with the run loop. I know a few things, but I'd really rather that somebody else do it. So I'm going to mark it needs a reviewer. So the labels are nice because at a glance, somebody can know what attention is needed. Remove jQuery from the component lifecycle. Straight conversion. Okay, so that's based on my work. Aw, this is very sweet. Okay, there's a lot of great things going on in this pull request. So I think this will be our last one before we finish up here. So a couple awesome things from this contributor. They linked all the issues that it was related to, which is awesome. They said here that they didn't change one of the examples because they wanted the diffs to be easier to see and review. That's very much appreciated. So they're trying very hard to not change too much at once. And that way we can kind of just step towards having better content. So that's one good thing that's happening. And then this other contributor has very generously commented on like a review style to add some of their own notes on how this pull request is handled because they had also worked on this issue concurrently. So it's really awesome that they just kind of chime in and they're helping out here.
Is it common for a PR to address multiple issues?
No, I wouldn't say it's common. Let me look at this for a second. So the purpose of this pull request is that Ember has made jQuery optional. And so really, and even even if you were still using jQuery in an app, it's one of those things where you don't really have to. There's like bigger, better things now, which is namely native DOM selectors, where, I guess some historical context that was shared with me was that jQuery provided a way across different browsers and different browser versions, provided a way for people to target different things in the DOM. And it was sort of like, saved the day in that regard. jQuery is a highly successful project in that their approach was so good that it became part of, browser APIs. And so in this example here, if we look at the diff, we're able to do things like this.element and call a lot of things like, set attributes and things like that using native DOM helpers. And so jQuery is no longer unnecessary. So in some ways, a library can be successful by being indispensable, but can also be successful by being so good that it becomes the status quo. And that's what jQuery has done. So we don't need it as a dependency anymore because we can rely on the browser. My favorite website for this is You Don't Need jQuery. You might not need jQuery, my bad. Which gives a side-by-side comparison of different jQuery functions and what the equivalent is in using native DOM selectors.
Yeah,
so
I've seen this website before, and it's kind of interesting how in some cases it actually takes more text to do it in jQuery.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't. It depends. But it's really nice. I love this website. I use it a lot because I learned jQuery first. Okay. Not sure why I learned jQuery first, but anyway. So, all right. We're gonna look at this pull request here for a minute. I'm sure how this works. Offset top document, nearest position document. The CodePen illustrating. So, since this person has already raised a couple questions, what I'm going to do is label this as a need contributor response, because I actually want to see, it looks to me like there's a couple legitimate questions, and so, and they're things that these two people probably know better than I do. So I'm kind of just going to wait and see what the original contributor says about those changes. I am still going to very quickly look it over, though, because if I spot something obvious, I want to tell them right away so they can just roll that into their other work and addressing the comments that the other contributor made. Because one of the most frustrating things when you're working on open source projects is having to make many series of many small pull requests. That gets old really quickly and it moves very slowly. So I want to try to minimize that. So I'm just going to read this here. The components element is accessible via the components this.element property. Element property allows you to access the component's DOM element. For example, you can set an attribute using element set attribute methods. This.element.set attribute. Okay. The element property will, by default, return a DOM object for the component's root element. But you can also target child elements within the components template by passing a selector to query selector or query selector all. So there's a lot of jargon in here, but again, the purpose of this pull request wasn't so much to clarify or simplify the language, it was to stop using jQuery. So this contributor made, sort of the MVP of changes to stop using jQuery. And so although when I read this sentence, I'm like, oh, I don't really like the sentence, if I wanted it to be changed, that, can be a separate pull request.
In most cases, do you prefer like a bunch of smaller pull requests compared to like one big one that makes a bunch of changes?
Yeah, in general, I do. I've made a couple pull requests myself that change a bunch of things, and in most cases, I ended up closing them and then later opening up a smaller pull request because there wasn't agreement on the full set of changes, so they never got merged. I was trying to rewrite some content, which is tricky business, but date picker library is usually attached to an input element, so we will use this element query selector to find the appropriate input in our components template. This element query selector, add event listener, element classless, remove element API 3.4. Okay. So here's an example of, we can start a review. We should say this link are links to the API docs. 2.2. How do I say this? I want to sound like I'm like giving out orders. This is the other thing. Can you change this link to use least? Okay. In the URL. So a lot of the times the work of a maintainer is not just about reviewing things, but thinking carefully about how their requests come across. Thanks. I'm going to do start a review. You'll see this little thing here, updated review changes. This person won't be able to see my comments until I finish my review by clicking that button. This element query selector, I don't know, scroll to top. Ooh.
So if you had clicked add a single comment, it would have immediately sent it off.
Yeah. Ooh. So this person even made a code pen. That's great. The bestest animation end. Okay. So, so I'm going to finish the review. One small change here. I'm going to summarize this a little bit. So, it would be helpful to have a twiddle that shows that these selectors work as shown in the guides. I also added one comment, one small edit for a URL.
So for this one, would the twiddle be taking the place of you copying it over to your hard drive and linking it to the other project?
No. So this content just becomes some written markdown files. What I'm saying is that these code block examples that are in the guides, we want to make sure that that's actual working code. Gotcha. And it's just markdown. It's not part of an app or anything. And so what I'm asking for here is like, hey, can we verify that these code blocks are actually functional?
Sure, that makes sense.
Which it's going to take a little bit of work, to be honest. We'll see what happens there. If anyone doesn't know, Ember Twiddle is super great because it's a place where you can make little demos of Ember apps and see them running here in real time. And a great way to share code and show like how something might be working or not working.
Yeah, that looks pretty convenient.
Yeah, it's nice. Okay. I think that wraps it up for tonight. So I've obviously got a couple more pull requests to go, but I'm gonna do those a little bit. Need a quick break first, and then get everything set up for the release of Ember 3.5. Not much is changing. It's mostly a bug fixes release, which is pretty common for the minor versions of Ember. But we still, a lot of people expect to see that 3.5 show up in the drop down menu. And so as soon as those libraries are shipped, we're going to try to get the guides out quickly. So anyway, thanks anyone who tuned in. And anyone who's watching this after the fact. If you have any questions, you can always find me on the Ember Community Discord, which if you go to emberjs.com, go to emberjs.com, go to community, Ember Community. The links to all of the various places to chat with other Ember devs are all here. So you can drop by the learning channel on Ember Discord and ask questions anytime. I'm also on Twitter, and my DMs are open. This is me, JWWEBER. My DMs are open, and so feel free to ping me if you're just getting started and want to know a little bit more about how to contribute. And lastly, if you haven't already signed up for Hacktoberfest, it's not too late. The pull requests count goes back to the first of the month, whether you were signed up on the first or not. So it's not like you missed out on anything. So hope to see everybody there. And also thank you to Braden for joining in and helping it so that I wasn't just talking to a wall.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jen, for walking through those PRs with us and for giving us a little insight into your thought process.
Cool. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.